Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, our panelists are tuning in from all over the world. None of us are in the same place, except Madeline and Jillian. I believe you're both in California, right?
I'm in California, yeah.
Yes. Okay, cool. We have Valeria in London and Micah in Paris, right? Micah, you're in Paris?
South of France, but...
South of France, that's right, I'm sorry. And so yes, we have a very global panel. We have a very global set of attendees. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm super excited about this conversation. While everyone joins, we'll just get a couple more in. Yesterday, there was this webinar that I really wanted to join, and because I didn't get a Google Calendar notification, I joined 15 minutes late. So I know that even if you really want to come, sometimes webinars just completely kind of slip your schedule. So we really appreciate you all sharing your time with us today. And panelists, thank you for sharing your time and your energy with us today. Really appreciate that. For anyone joining right now, if you want to throw into the chat where you're joining from, that would be wonderful. Also, if you want to put into the chat which languages you speak, that would be great too. All right, and I will quickly share my screen just for some intro slides. All right, can everyone see? Great. Okay, so this is Ask Me Anything About Teaching Your Bot Another Language. And we have an amazing panel today. So I will do some quick introductions. All right, Madeline. Madeline is a linguist by training whose specialties include conversation, ethnography, language revitalization, language ideologies, and language in performance. Her work experience includes UX content strategy, technical communication, research, education, multilingual translation management, and intercultural communication. Madeline speaks American Sign Language, French, Breton, and Japanese, as well as English, and has lived in Japan and France, as well as the US. Thanks so much for being with us today, Madeline.
Happy to be here.
All right, and Micah. Micah is an award-winning conversational UX designer and strategist, keynote speaker, trainer, and co-author of the Voice UX workbook. With over a decade of experience in linguistics and experience design, she found conversational UX the perfect blend. Micah is passionate about bridging the gap between brands and their customers and creating a connection with conversations. Thanks for being with us today, Micah. All right, and Jillian. Jillian has her master's in teaching English as a second language and Spanish, and did a 1.5 years of PhD coursework in applied linguistics. She knew she wanted to work in the cross-section of tech, linguistics, and Spanish, and did so while she was a modeler and trainer for Apple's Siri in Spanish. Thanks for being with us today, Jillian. And Valeria. Valeria is a business director for Mother Tongue. Based out of New York, she heads the business development of Mother Tongue in the US, and she is currently leading a program on the localization of voice and voice-first content. Thanks for being with us today, Valeria.
Thank you.
All right, so we got so many questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted them. We had over 100 registrants, and I think right now we're up to about 35 attendees, which is great. And people from all over the world. So thank you for tuning in today. And some housekeeping. So this session will be recorded. We also have closed captioning. Thanks to Madeline for bringing that up beforehand. We will definitely be doing this for all of our future webinars as well. And the recording will be emailed to you afterwards. So as you go, please ask questions in the chat, or if you find the Q&A feature to be more helpful, feel free to use that too. All right, and I think this brings us to the first question. Let me stop the music really quick. And Micah, this one is for you to start off with. So, do conversation designers need to be native speakers of the language they design in? What do you think about that?
So, first of all, I think that conversation designers need to have at least native speaker fluency, so high proficiency in the language they design in. That being said, conversation design is never happening in a vacuum. So conversation designers are not an island, and it's a collaborative process, and no design should go without feedback. So I think that if we have a native speaker validation, that is a must-have, because there's just so many things that no matter how long you have spoken a language, no matter how much time you have spent in a certain country, there's always these linguistic subtleties that are part of the culture, that are part of the education that you might have had as a child, as you constitute your own linguistic realm, that are very hard to grasp. And so as long as the conversation designer is fluent enough in the target language and there's a solid review process in place by native speakers, and I actually think that it's a richness as it brings in diversity and a view of non-native speakers. It helps enriching the design team. They'll bring different accents, different turn-taking behavior, different phrasing, different vocabulary, different ways of expressing themselves. For example, something that you could notice with non-native speakers, that they tend to use a lot of words to describe an idea or a topic, or just something that could be expressed in one word in the target language, but because they don't know the word, they just go about it in a very circumvalent way. So,
thanks, Micah. Valeria, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's definitely the way you want to go with native speakers. And in general, I mean, both with, with assistant, with bots, you need to have an understanding of the dynamic of the dialogue and how, conversations usually happen. And it's very peculiar to every culture. So, there is the broader cultural aspects and then the linguistic one.
Thanks, Valeria. Madeline, what do you think?
Absolutely, I agree with everything that's been said. It's really important to have an extremely high level of proficiency in order to carry out this kind of work, and fluent, both in the sense of knowing the language end to end, knowing how conversations work, and also not just from a school or decontextualized perspective, but you really, if it's somebody who hasn't lived in that culture that you're targeting, they probably aren't fluent in the way that you need for this kind of situation.
Thank you all for, those are great answers. I also remember a conversation I had with Ilana Mir, who's a conversation designer at Facebook. And something she said on this topic really stuck out to me. She mentioned that if you aren't a native speaker, then you in some ways can have a completely different perspective on how a non-native speaker would actually talk to your system too. So that can bring a very unique perspective to your team as well. So any final thoughts on this? Awesome. All right, Jillian, how do we bridge the data gap to formal and informal regional slangs?
And for that, it's just making sure you have enough volume to feed into the algorithm so that it recognizes that this is a synonym of that, and that you're always keeping on top of what the new slang and regional dialects are. When I was at Apple, we had Spain Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and US Spanish, since the United States is like the second largest country with Spanish speakers. All right, I don't think I said that right, but we had to make sure that we programmed synonyms for everything and that we knew enough culturally about what's going on in Mexico and what's going on in Spain and what's going on here in all the other countries to know that this is all equal so that the model can recognize it.
Thanks, Jillian. And Valeria, if you want to speak to that one, and also a sort of related question, how do you see NLU progressing to include dialects?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely it comes down to a matter of data, you know, how much data and how much good data you have on all of this. That said, I mean, from a localization perspective, I must say that slangs, dialects, and all of that are very poorly represented in general in the world of localization. There are entire continents that are poorly represented in the world of localization, and that usually boils down to the fact that there isn't enough incentive to make investments in you know, different dialects and languages and all of that. So the perspective, you know, the fact that there is an investment perspective matters a lot. But for example, recently the BBC has launched their own digital assistant. It's called Beep, actually this year itself. Their perspective was very interesting because from day one, they were thinking of this as a public service. So what they did, they collected a lot of data in all of the UK, and I think that Beep can understand 16 different accents, including like you know, accents of foreigners that have moved to the UK. So they really built it with the idea of being very, very inclusive, and that's something that you can do if you start off with the idea that this is really a public service and you have to, you know, include as many different accents as possible. So, you know, that matters a lot. I'm not sure how much this is feasible with, you know, digital assistants or chatbots that are, you know, conceived with the idea of serving a very specific service, but not, you know, not with the idea of bringing in as much variety as possible. So it really depends. I mean, I would love for you know, digital NLU to become this kind of repositories for all the languages that are very quickly disappearing, and just to have that as you know, a heritage of humanity. But I don't think that this will happen if it is left up to, you know, just the commercial enterprise, the business world. So maybe if there is a very strong interest from some either national or international organizations, and if they have the funding, then that can become, you know, a big opportunity to have that as a repository of all these knowledge. But just to put some numbers to it, there's over 7,000 languages in the world, but you only need 23 languages to cover over 50% of the population. So if you think about it, you know, the investment to cover 23 languages and then the rest, so to cover the rest, it takes much more of an investment, and there just is not enough of a business case to actually do it. So even if, you know, we could have that from a technology perspective, which is not necessarily, I mean, you need to have a language model for every dialect, for every slang. Otherwise, your data gets muddled if you put all that data into the same model. So if you think from that perspective, and even if it is doable from a technology level, you might not have a good business case to actually do it.
Yeah, earlier this year, and I guess, yeah, with the business versus just more the public service stuff or academia wanting to have a repository of all these accents. There is hope, I guess, for business paying attention to more accented speech. Earlier this year, I helped AWS with this contract to do accented speech for foreign accented speech. So Chinese immigrants, Spanish-speaking immigrants, and then also several different dialects within the US. AAVE and Boston accent is what we did. So there's definitely hope on the business side of it because, yeah, when we're working with companies, they're trying to make money, and so we can't always be doing stuff just for fun. But if we can make a case and make a business case for having the digital assistants be able to understand these accents, we're going to be in a much better position. So.
Thanks, Jillian. You mentioned that you did the Boston accent and AAVE.
Yeah.
For someone who doesn't know what AAVE is, can you explain that?
Yep, AAVE is African American Vernacular English. And so it's a really well-studied dialect that basically African Americans in the US speak. So there's a different grammar, there are different words and stuff like that. So a lot of times digital assistants have a difficult time understanding them. And because they do have such buying power in the US, it is pretty important that the assistants can understand them.
Thank you. Okay, that was a very interesting discussion. So, Valeria, if you want to start us off again on this one, what should be taken into account when designing a multilingual chatbot?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, from a localization perspective, you should. I mean, the chatbot itself is a product, so what you should start with is really strong research and start cooperating with the localization team as soon as possible. Because even the design itself is influenced by the number of languages and the markets where you want to deploy it. So the sooner you start, the better it is. If you just build with a one language perspective, and then when you reach the stage where you want to adapt it, there are always going to be issues. Well, if you take localization into account from the very beginning, that really makes a difference. It can avoid costly mistakes and all of that. From a technical perspective, of course, your app needs to be internationalized according to all the standards, so that when you add other languages, you don't run into problems. But also from a persona perspective. So when you're designing a digital assistant or a chatbot, you have to have a persona in mind. And when you design for multiple cultures, multiple languages, you have to avoid or include certain characteristics. You want to have a persona that is, more neutral and, possibly more toned down, because there are some characteristics that, while they are maybe good in one culture, they are not so good in another. So you want to strike a balance between basically try to give a pleasant experience to all your users, irrespective of their culture and their country. So yeah, it's really important to bring in the localization team early enough, just when you start thinking about the design, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Valeria. And actually, someone just asked in the chat for a concrete example about a personality trade-off that would have to be made. Maybe we can address that after Madeline, Micah, and Jillian speak to this as well. So, Madeline, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's very important when you're thinking about a chatbot. How do you approach different languages, and how do you translate the content from the language into another? One major aspect of that is when you're translating, it's not really just words and grammar. There's more to it, because words themselves have what linguists talk about as semantic range that can vary a lot from one language to another. I'll give you a really simple example from Japanese. In English, we have the word leg and we have the word foot. In Japanese, the word ashi means both. So when you're translating, you have to know and you have to be prepared for the fact that there isn't always a clean one-to-one correspondence. So you have to look more globally than just an individual word. And again, that's why it's important to get really, really fluent or native speakers. Another aspect is the pragmatics of language. So for example, the rules of engagement, somebody earlier, I think Micah mentioned turn taking, functions a bit differently. How we give feedback, which is in English, we might say, or yeah, or both how do you give feedback in a conversation, but also what does that feedback mean? Does it mean you're agreeing with something or you're just listening? Do you, how do you use greeting words? Do you say, like, for example, in English, we say good night. What does that mean though? Good night means essentially goodbye at night. But in French, if I say bonne nuit, that doesn't mean that actually. Okay, so you also have bonsoir, you have bonne soirée. So you have these different words that have different pragmatic functions, but they all kind of translate as good night essentially. But some of them are about saying goodbye, some of them are greetings, some of them are for when you're going to sleep versus when you're parting. So there's a lot of different things that you have to take into account when you think about translating. And that's why a machine can't really take, well, I don't know if they ever will, but certainly right now, they can't take into account the pragmatics as well as the subtleties of that semantic range difference between one language and another. I'll give one more, which is color. Color is crazy because color words, some cultures have one word for green and blue. Some cultures have, like English, green and blue. Some have more than one word for green, more than one word for blue. It depends on a lot of different specificities within that culture. So there's a lot of depth to understanding language well enough to do translation that's really going to be on target. And with a bot, you don't have any other input. You don't have intonation. You don't have the visual. So you've got to get it right.
Those are great examples, Madeline. I actually also have one good example of this so Divyansh is one of my team members. He's actually in the chat right now, and he is in India. I'm in the US. So when we have our morning meetings, it feels very weird for me to say, hey, good night, because that's a goodbye. So instead I say good evening, because that can still kind of be a greeting. And it's also to indicate that I'm thinking about how it is his nighttime. Micah, what should be taken into account when designing a multilingual chatbot?
Yeah, I agree with Madeline. I would definitely not say bonne nuit in a just evening setting, because that could create all sorts of weird situations. It's what you say when someone goes to bed. So, there's a few things that have been mentioned before. Valeria mentioned persona. So I have very opinionated take on persona. That comes from the fact that I had worked on different transcreation projects in which I realized even more than just gut feeling and the fact that I didn't want to stigmatize stereotypes with conversation design. But other than that, some mental models, some images just don't make sense in different countries. And we can go into that a bit later, but an example that I like to give is a hospitality bot I worked on, and the initial idea was to have this bot be a butler, which in a UK setting makes total sense because they have a very high, deeply embedded culture and mental model of what is a butler, what does a butler. Whereas then looking at the French market, all of that persona work was lost. It was just lost on them. is this a concierge, which is kind of the French equivalent, but doesn't have the same personality, doesn't do exactly the same thing in a hotel. So that really struck with me as an example, because I can tell you there had been a lot of brand effort put into this persona work. Other than that, I find language is rich enough and has functionality enough to instill personality without having to have an avatarized persona per se. And that allows that has to do with internationalization, but it allows for more fluent internationalization, because you're not stuck on this mental model that might not work in certain countries. So that's one of the things that struck me. Another thing is the way you use words and their semantic array, as Madeline says. I had a very funny conversation one day. I was talking about the design studio I was working with. And this is a couple of years ago, but still it just rang that bell inside my mind, so I can't forget it. I was talking with someone who said, this is great, I'm working with this person, he has a 12-person studio, which I'm now going to be part of, blah, blah, blah. And the other participant in the conversation went, oh my God, he must be very rich to have a 12-person studio, and what is it like, and what furniture does the studio have? Because in that other person language, a studio was actually an apartment, and the correlation with studio and design didn't happen, because they'd use another or totally different word for it that would be closer to the semantic field of agency, basically. So I definitely have seen lots of examples there as well. But other than that, I think there's a few important points that when you start thinking about localization, ideally, obviously, you'd have the localization team be part of the entire process, and we can talk about that later on. But if it's not, it makes a big difference as to the process that you're going to go through. So I think the starting point of what should be taken into account is there already a pre-existing experience that we are transcreating? Are there things in that existing experience that currently show friction when it comes to user experience? And can we avoid making the same mistakes in the transcreated experience? Or are we completely starting afresh, in which case we can integrate the localization as part of the next thing? But a lot of the time, it's not the case. A lot of the time with these conversational projects, it starts somewhere in an innovation department or marketing department, and let's try this out and let's start building this. And if it works, then we'll expand. Or if it gets enough traction, then we'll think about other languages, then we'll think about adding scope, etc., etc. I think another thing to think about is validating the use case. Does this use case make sense in the language or the culture that you are targeting? There are some use cases that in some countries just don't make sense, or they just wouldn't be adopted, or one would never use a conversational bot to perform that particular task. So is that use case something valid? And in the target locale, do people want to use a conversational interface to be performing this task or to do this particular thing? One use case that I particularly think of is games, for example. Depending on the country we're in, we don't play the same kind of games. Even very common games in certain countries might just not make sense at all. And then on another thing that we should take into account is how does the target language influence the conversational flows? Because as Madeline so rightly said, it's not only about vocabulary, it's not only about sentences, it's also about the entire information architecture and the conversational flow. And as an example, I'd take something like e-commerce, for example, or lead conversion. In European countries, if you start your conversation with very personal questions around what is your name, how old are you, what country do you live in, what is your function in your company, and we all know these kind of forms where you need to fill in your details and you feel like the next thing they're going to ask you is, what did you have for dinner? Whereas in Asian countries, in East Asia, it's common cultural practice to get to know a person better through personal questions before engaging in a business relationship. So that totally changes the way you think about a conversation. And then finally, and then I'm going to shut up because I feel like I'm just talking on and on, is how descriptive or how contextualized is the language, because you're targeting, because some languages are more context driven, are more descriptive than others, and that influences a lot of things: the length of the conversation, the length of your prompts. And that ties into the very last thing that we need to be thinking about. How does the graphical user interface, when it comes to textual chatbots or to multimodal, needs to adapt for this multilingual conversations?
Thank you, Micah. Those were amazing examples. Jillian, what do you take into account when you're designing multilingual
Definitely
chatbots?
hit the nail on the head already. I mean, just semantics and pragmatics need to be taken into account. And going back to the person's question, one thing for Apple, and this is not officially what happened, I don't really know what the behind the scenes decision was, but in the past, Siri had a bit more snark. She would be more sarcastic or use humor in certain ways that were more acceptable for the United States. But as more and more billions of people started using it and putting it in English, maybe not their native language, I think they started just to become a bit put off by her snark and not really appreciating that humor. And so as we have more and more languages that are using your bot or your VA, just to be sure to make sure that cultural things like humor are transferring, and if they're not, it's okay to have to kind of just rewrite what your script is, because it might just not be appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, there was one example. In the US, we are very much used to hearing, oh, a very direct conversation to the point is the best. That's the way you want to go. But that's not necessarily true for all cultures. In some cultures, a very direct comment can be perceived as very curt, even rude. And you have to be very careful, especially with voice interfaces, because voice hits you in a different way compared to text written language. It's even more emotional. It has a stronger emotional pull. So you really have to find a fine balance and a fine line when you're localizing voice.
Yeah, and then sometimes it just comes down to that one word. I remember this example where as a confirmation we used sure, whereas sure meaning just yes in our minds, but actually in other people's minds it meant perhaps, maybe, if you want to, with a bit of a snark to it, as Shannon says, like, okay, whatever.
I'm angry, so yeah, be careful.
Yeah, exactly. So it comes down to every word matters, really, even when it comes to conversation design, but even more so when it comes to localization.
Yep.
I'll just throw in one more quick example, which is the word okay has a different feeling for English speakers than when people translate into it. It has a very kind of what we'd call almost a negative valence. It's like, it's okay. It can be positive, but it's often very negative. And moving between English and another language, a word that might have a very positive valence, you don't want to match it up with okay, or you'd have to really be careful about it. There's just so many subtleties.
Yeah, exactly. That made me think of another example. We're going to just, that's linguists between them. They just start geeking out about language. But one example is about words that are very close in different languages. For example, in French, you'd have sympathique, which would actually mean very friendly, someone you get along nicely with. Which in English would translate to sympathetic, and then in Dutch it's sympathiek, but in Dutch it actually means someone that's okay, but that you won't say about that you don't really like them. It's like, okay, she's okay, but don't really like her. So that gives them for some very interesting things.
Wow, I feel like I just stumbled upon a treasure trove of examples of all of these things. So thank you all for that. That was
Valence
amazing.
and Jillian, we didn't hear you.
Oh, I was sorry. I was on mute. They decided to do construction upstairs just now. Sorry. I hope you don't hear it. But yeah, I was just going to say, like sympathique and sympathetic, they're even kind of different in English and French. So yeah, that's why we can't just leave it to the machines for sure. It's careful work.
Yes. Okay. Cool. I think if no one has anything else, we will move on. If you do, that's totally fine. This was a great question.
Noise?
Yeah, a little bit, not too bad.
Remind me to unmute.
Okay. Okay. Oh, Madeline, you're first. Do you take culture and localization into account when translating for bots? I feel like we kind of just talked about this, but if you have anything else to add, feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, the one word answer is yes. And I'll just give one example for looking at Japanese and English. You know, language is embedded with the culture. So there's no separating them out. You really have to be aware. So in Japanese, well, in English, we have the word you and I, or me, which is just a grammar distinction. But we have you and I. But what about in Japanese? There are so many words for saying you. There are words for saying I. There are also, so part of that is how much respect you're showing or what position you are vis-a-vis the other person. There's also, with every verb, there can be a way to show respect up or the other way down. Also with formality in Japanese, you have, it's like the tu and vous, you know, in French, where you have the sort of formality. You have that also with Japanese, whether you use the desmas ending or not. The plain language shows that we're close, but we might be at different levels, but we're close. So there's multiple dimensions with Japanese you have to take into account. You have to make decisions. How are we going to say you? How are we going to say I or me? How are we going to go for really neutral verbs? Are we going to aim up to show respect to the user? There's so many different decisions to be made. So Japanese culture is so completely different from American culture. You have to consider it.
That's a whole can of worms, the tu and vous, Madeline.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
I think some French people don't even quite know at some points in their relationship what is who doing what.
So decisions have to be made, but it's I think the point is it has to be a really conscious decision. Don't fall into something that might create damage to the image of your bot, might offend people.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Jillian, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to add is to, okay, so I speak English and Spanish. And so there's tons of countries in the world that speak English. There's tons of countries in the world that speak Spanish. However, each country speaks it in a different way. And so, for example, in Spain, they're much more, it's much easier to fall into the to or the informal you form of verbs. And that's totally fine to talk to a grandma like that or anybody on the street like that. However, in Mexico, they definitely honor that system, and you have to know that person until you can go into the familiar you. So like Madeline just said, you need to make sure that you have an idea of how friendly you want your bot to be to the person, and if it's culturally okay to slip into the informal or formal verbs.
Thanks, Jillian. Valeria?
Yeah, I mean, I second everything that has been said, but going back to the previous point, you know, if you bring in your localization team early enough at the design level, all these things actually go into the persona, and you know, you can start thinking about the kind of persona you want to be, the tone of voice, the register, and all of this, you know, the persona also has to be aligned not only with the end users, you know, the audience and the market, but also with your company values. For example, if inclusivity is a very strong value of your company, then you have to make sure that that goes into the design of your persona. And of course, the, you know, the tone of voice, the register, you want to sound really quirky and friendly, and be this kind of young and dynamic personality, but that might not go well in some cultures and with some type of apps. For example, you know, it's quite well known that if for some verticals they prefer a male voice because it's taken to convey more authority, more authoritative knowledge. So if you design your persona to be, you know, with a young woman, dynamic woman in mind, that might not really go. So these are all the very important things that you can get out of, you know, a good cooperation with a localization team that can do enough research and bring in all this knowledge early on in the design, so you don't have to make costly changes later on.
Thanks, Valeria. Micah, anything to add?
No, I think that everything has been said. The short answer is effectively yes. You take into account culture and localization. I would say that there is a fine thread to walk when doing that, because you don't want to localize things to a point where it almost becomes a gimmick, if that makes sense, because you also need to take into account that we are a multicultural tribe, and that there is no such thing as this kind of person lives in this kind of country and speaks this kind of language, although that might be the majority of users. If you go too far in localization and too far in adapting for culture, then it becomes exclusive. So it's a very, very thin line between being localized enough versus being too localized, and therefore excluding all of the global people that we are, and we live in different countries, and we speak different languages, and we come from all sorts of origins. So I just want to put out a little warning sign around, it's about being and tailoring to culture and localization, but it's not about going so far that you by essence then exclude the more global population. So yeah.
So it's more about being selective about how you're tailoring it and being aware of everything that could be done, and then choosing specifically the whatever is needed in order to make that conversation the most natural it could be for a given group of users.
Yes, and I think it's also about understanding what the user is there for and what they are setting out to do, and allowing them to be able to do that without coming up and coming up and hitting language barriers and not understanding what they need to do. So I think it's using localization in function of the user and what they are trying to accomplish. And so there's loads of things like labels for buttons on chatbots, for example, and all of those examples that we've given of words that don't mean exactly the same thing. So making sure that those things stay clear and that the user experience is not hindered by the language, rather than gimmicking localization to a point where it's just the localization people having fun with it. So
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you never want to, I mean, you have to have a strong brand behind it, right? And that's something, there is always a point where you risk losing your brand if you hyper localize. So it's again, it's a fine line. You have to find that sweet spot that gives you the best bang for the buck. Basically, you know, your investment in localization will bring in, you know, enough investment back to you, but you also have to do it the right way. Yeah.
Okay, and I want to pause for a second. This past question sparked some really interesting questions in the chat. So for our panelists, if you want to either speak to one of these questions in a later question, or just type kind of your thoughts in the chat, I'll read them off really quick just so we can kind of surface them, and then we'll move on to the next question in the slide. So first, Yasmin asked, how do you test linguists' assumptions about the valence of words? What, for instance, if your linguists disagree? I'm going to mispronounce your name. I'm very, very sorry, but Peter Jan, for chatbots, would you also localize emojis? I can imagine that certain languages are more prone to use them. Is this included in the process? And Angela asked, just out of curiosity, how are chatbots generally perceived in Japan? And Joe Kim, I hope I pronounced your name right too. Are there cultural markers you can use to measure things like formality, like % of self-identified Catholics, rural versus urban, etc.? And then Rebecca asked, I've heard people use the term register in several different ways. I'm curious how panelists would define it. So these are amazing questions. I wish we could talk about all of them. We only have 10 more minutes, so we will keep moving on the slide. But again, if panelists or any attendees have ideas about this, please type your answer in the chat. All right, so Jillian, what is a challenge you didn't expect when converting to another language?
Oh man, I'm totally blanking because I'm thinking about those other questions.
Oh. I mean, if you want to respond to one of those questions, that's also fine. I mean, this is an AMA, so pick whatever you want to talk about right now.
I'm blanking on everything. I'm gonna pass it out to Mark.
That's not fair, Jillian. Yeah, well, I'll pick it up. I'm going to answer what is a challenge with an answer to Rebecca's question about register, because that's one of the challenges that I did recently. Same with subscribe, by the way. I recently had actually a chatbot that we're working on. And I did want to use the word register as in sign up, but then we did some user testing, and it turned out that part of the people that used that register button thought they were saving something somewhere, and then we're like, where did I just save this? But no, you're signing up. Well, anyway. So there are different ways of thinking about register, which like one of those words, and most of the time it's about finding synonyms that are clearer, that are more that only have one particular meaning that is really clear. Andy said, were those English users? Yes, they were English native users, by the way. So yeah, so register was very, very interesting. I had the same thing with subscribe at some point, which I thought was really clear, but apparently was not. And so that was one challenge that I didn't expect when converting to another language, because this was originally a French chatbot. And then another thing another challenge I didn't expect when converting to another language is how difficult it is for some product people to understand how complex language can be. And then on the other hand, how difficult it can be for transgraders and localization teams to understand the subtleties of conversation design. And that would give very interesting discussions. And I think that ties into questions about how do you kind of validate linguistic assumptions and so on and so forth. That gave way to some very, very interesting conversations where it was, this is not conversational enough because it was very descriptive in the translation. It was very textual, very literary. And then on the other hand, yeah, but if you want to do it this way, it doesn't really mean the same thing. And very interesting conversations going on. And the best way to actually validate assumptions is to test it with users. And I feel like that's something I say all the time, but it's so very true. Because we all have our own linguistic realms and things that we think to be true. We all have our linguistic biases as well. So yeah, that's how you validate assumptions, and that was that collaboration between localization and product goals is not always the most straightforward, I would say. And one solution to that I found was to have the transcreation team interact with the product in a very intensive manner, not just giving them, hey, here are all the prompts that we want translated, please do the translation, but really have a very intensive process of going through the experience several times in the original language to really grasp the goal of the experience, to grasp the tone of voice also that is being conveyed. And that I found has really, really helped with bringing it all together.
For sure.
Yeah, I would agree. That's really crucial. Is that cooperation that it gives you the context in which you actually recreate those dialogues. And I mean, of course, voice has added elements of complexity. I find, but yeah, basically that cooperation is crucial. But just a quick note about the way Mike took the Rebecca's question on register. I would have taken that completely different. I thought she was actually referring to the register in the sense of how you address a specific audience, more or less formal. To me, that was register. And this is the beauty of language. She was thinking about a button. I was thinking about how you address.
Yeah, and it's funny, it's because I just had that kind of challenge over the last couple of weeks. My entire bias with the word register is now about buttons.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. So meta right now in this conversation. Okay, with only 5 minutes left. Jillian, did you have, okay, no?
Yeah, they kind of, I guess for I don't know. There is always some surprises. I think just culturally, I think working on a language and just seeing how people use it so differently and just having to, yeah, strike that balance between having everybody understand it and also be localized enough was hard for English and Spanish, which is super broad.
Okay, let's see. We haven't even gotten through half these questions, so we might need a round 2 of this maybe next year. We've got 5 minutes, so maybe we can wrap up with just this last one. So Madeline, what are the benefits of being multilingual as a UX designer for voice products?
Oh, good. I remembered to unmute this time. So the benefits of being multilingual, for me, I find that when I work with like translations or any kind of multilingual context, it gives me insight, even if I don't know the specific language. For example, I once worked on a like 22 language translation project, and I received the translations and I found errors, and they weren't even languages I knew. It's just that I knew to look. It's partly my background in linguistics too, but I knew to look for patterns. I knew to look for consistency. And so I was able to go back to the people who'd done the translation and say, I think there's something wrong here. The other part of it is what we've been talking about all along, which is really there's so many things to take into consideration when you're doing a multilingual project that you're just going to be more sensitive to it. You're going to be more sensitive to the issues, to the problems, to where you're going to get tripped up. And if I can make a little suggestion, if anybody's thinking, oh, I should become multilingual, on the practical level, you might pick certain languages, but in terms of developing your awareness of these kinds of issues, pick some really different language. Learn an Asian language, learn an African language if you're an English speaker, get something under your belt that will really broaden your horizons, both in terms of the way words are used and the grammar and conversational style. And that'll really, really just broaden your perspective.
Thanks, Madeline. A quick note, because we only have 2 minutes and we may go over. So I know many of our attendees and I know our panelists are very busy people. So if you need to head out now or right at the hour, please feel free to do that. And anyone who does want to stick around just to close out this question, absolutely would love if you did that too. So Valeria, what do you think are the benefits of being multilingual?
Well, I mean, as Madeline was saying, yeah, I absolutely think that it helps, and I think that it helps especially at the level of being able to strategize and to think ahead. It gives you an advantage because you can sort of predict that there are going to be some issues, even if it is just something, about the layout. Most languages, or probably all languages, are between 30 and 70% longer than English. So, if you can plan ahead so that, you can include that in your design for chatbots, that's really important if there is text. In general, even just to strategize about the layout and the sequence of languages and all of that. Languages have commonalities, so you can create synergies when you're launching. So for all of these reasons, having knowledge about foreign languages is very useful, yeah, and it's fun.
Thanks, Valeria. Micah?
Yeah, a lot of the benefits Madeline and Valeria have already talked about. I definitely think that it also helps you better understand overlay between different languages. And it helps you understand difficulties that users that are multilingual can encounter. And as an example, with a voice experience, for example, when it comes to music. So the thing is, Alexa is localized for French-speaking people, right? However, in France. However, people that currently live in France and are using Alexa perhaps ask for a certain song or a certain artist within the regular English accent. So what happens is that I've done some user testing. I've met some people that are actually from abroad, UK people that live in France. They have Alexa. They have their Alexa set to French because they also want to kind of learn French. But then when they ask for a song, when they ask for music, they just pronounce the artist's name and the song's name right in English. Only Alexa doesn't understand them. So it's really funny to see UK people trying to take on a French accent to pronounce the name of an English artist. It gives really funny situations, but it's also really frustrating for them because all that they want to do is just hear a song.
Yes, absolutely. I had a bunch of coworkers who were working on the HomePod. So that's the new speaker that you can talk to and ask it to play songs and stuff. So they were for all different languages. And then, yeah, just the prevalence of American or just English songs. It was a running joke because they would come to me and ask me, how do you actually say this in American English? Okay, and then they'd run back and try it. So there's right there is a benefit of being multilingual because I'm working on the Spanish stuff and then they come and ask me an English question and you kind of have almost two employees in one and you can do a lot of just a broader amount of work.
Yeah. And there's so many intriguing things with being multilingual or designing for multilingual experiences. And I have this one example where we were trying to do a chatbot for a Spanish company, and their target audience was both Spanish audience and UK audience that lived in Spain. And what was really interesting when we did user research is that part of the UK audience actually wanted to interact with the conversational application in Spanish because they were in Spain and they wanted to learn Spanish and they wanted to use it into Spanish. Versus when we originally designed it, we thought, well, we'll have two flows, of a Spanish flow and an English flow. And then very surprised that the English audience didn't really want to go through the English experience, but they wanted to have the Spanish experience because it's part of the whole thing. So yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, and with that, we are out of time. We still have 36 attendees that have stuck with us 5 minutes over, so I think this was amazing. Thank you all for your insights. Hopefully we can do a round 2 in the early part of next year. If not, hopefully we can somehow get the rest of these questions answered. Thank you for everyone who submitted them. And the next AMA is in January. It will be about using a background in writing as a conversation designer. So if you want to join that, please do. And just one last shameless plug. If you want to test out everything you learned today about multilingual chatbots, Botmock does support multilingual flows. So check us out. We have a free tier. And with that, thank you to the panelists. Thank you, attendees. And I hope to see all of you soon in our wonderful conversation design community.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Brielle.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
This has been great.
Yeah, I just want to still hang out and talk about language now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Me too.
Have to plan for round 2.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. All right, so it's very sad, but I'll have to end the webinar now, so we will all be
Bye.
into
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.